So, welcome to Module 5 of this theoretical history course. And this is all about social evolution and progress. So, we're interested in the way that the human race has gone from a population of about 1 million people to a population of nearly 10 billion people, an increase of 10,000 times. So, we're interested in the growth of human capabilities, in the growth of technology and ideas, and the growth of population that these things have made possible. So in this module, we're really interested in the economic side of life, in how by building and innovation and exchange, people have become capable of doing more things and feeding more people. And we'll be touching on all the theories that deal with those issues. And the module will be divided into 4 lessons. So the first lesson will be all about economics. So all those aspects of economics that we need to know as theoretical historians. So the kinds of things we'll be looking at will be economic models, globalization, what it is, how it works. We'll be looking at trade, the logic of trade, very important in human history, and we'll be looking at development. So how less developed societies can become more developed societies, the mechanisms of economic development. Second lesson will be all about population. And we'll start off with the ideas of Thomas Malthus about how population grows too fast and you end up with overpopulation. This is something that people have, been worried about for an awfully long time. And it still has a grip on people's minds. People worry about it today, that there's too many people, we're using up all the Earth's resources, and there's no planet B, and all those sorts of ideas. So we'll be dealing with that. And then we'll consider how, despite all these fears and the grip that this way of thinking has on people's mind, there has actually been a great long-term population growth. The one that I talked about just now, the increase from 1 million to 10 billion. How has that occurred? And this long-term growth of the human population is really the fundamental historical process. History is the story of the growth of the human population, and everything else is detail. We can consider it from that perspective. And then lastly, here we'll be considering what I call the peopling of the earth. The earth, symbol from astronomy. So by this I mean migration, the movement of people around the world, the way that people spread to all parts of the earth, how that occurred, theories and models of that process. Then third lesson will be on technology. So we'll start with thinking about how you measure complexity of societies, technological complexity. And by technology, we don't necessarily just mean material gadgets like, your iPhone and cars and things, but also social technologies like parliaments and banks, kind of social behaviours that also can be considered technology. So how do we quantify the growth of complexity that we can intuitively see? And then we'll consider also technology webs. So technologies are connected with each other. So you can have a stone axe and a stick, and then you put them together and you've got a spear. So technologies can combine to create new technologies, and so they form these linked webs of technologies interdependent. And lastly, we'll just consider some models of technological evolution, the processes that describe this recombination of technologies. And then lesson 4, the final lesson, is on innovation. So technology comes about through innovation, but we'll consider innovation as a process in its own right, have a whole lesson devoted to that. So one of the aspects of that we'll be thinking about human creativity. So we know that some people are more creative than other people, so we'll be considering the distribution of creativity in societies and the implications of that. We'll talk about the Phoenix principle. This is the principle that you sometimes have to go backwards in order to go forwards. You sometimes have to destroy in order to create, to innovate, the Phoenix principle. And we'll consider industrial revolutions, what they are, how they work. So notice not just one industrial revolution, but there have been multiple industrial revolutions through history. We'll talk about those. And lastly, we'll talk about diffusion of innovations. So technologies, innovations arise in one place, and then they spread through a population, through a society, and to other societies. So we'll look at the theories of the diffusion of innovations. So welcome to lesson 5.1, which is about economics. And this lesson is going to be divided into several parts. So this is part 1, which is about some economic laws or economic principles. So we're not going to be studying these just for the sake of it, but because we will be drawing upon these ideas later on in our theories of history. So it's useful to cover these now so that when we get to those, we can assume that we understand these economic principles and that we have a common understanding of what they mean. So we're going to be looking at a total of 8 economic principles, and the first idea is that of import substitution. So suppose you are a society that doesn't know how to make pots, but your neighbours do know how to make pots. And you can see that pots are a good thing to have. And though you don't make pots, you do grow tomatoes. So what you can do is say to your neighbours, look, let's offer you some of our tomatoes in return for some of your pots. And so you're able to buy their pots with your tomatoes. And so you import those pots and you now have pots, and that's great. But then what can happen is that some bright spark in your society says, well, look, why don't we learn how to make our own pots? And so they copy the process, and so they start making pots locally. And they can make them more cheaply because they no longer have to import them over long distances. And so people start buying the local pots instead of the imported ones from the other society. So that is an example of import substitution. And another thing that can happen is, let's say that you're a society that grows cotton and makes your textiles out of cotton, and your neighbours know how to make silk, and you like silk, so you import some of their silk. And you can't start growing silk locally because you don't have the conditions for growing silk. But what some bright spark can do is invent a process of treating cotton to make it more silky. And so it becomes a kind of cheap substitute for silk it's a silky form of cotton. And people, because it's so much cheaper and it's very close to silk, people start buying that, a local form of silk, they substitute for silk, instead of importing from the other society, or they don't import so much silk. So in that case, it was an innovation that led to import substitution. And these processes then have knock-on effects, because when before you were using your tomatoes to buy your neighbour's pots, there were people in your society and their society who were making this trade happen. And when you stop buying their pots, those people, their business model disappears. And so, they're out of work. And that can create social tensions. And you might also have the people who were importing your tomatoes to sell you their pots relied on your supply of tomatoes, and now that you don't really need their pots anymore, they don't have a supply of tomatoes, and so they may want to go to war with you about that, or even invade you and take over your tomato plantations. So import substitution can drive historical processes. And import substitution was a factor in the British Industrial Revolution. So Britain was importing things like porcelain from China and cotton from India. But then local entrepreneurs in Britain worked out how to make these things locally. And not just to make them locally, but with the new factories and steam power, to make them much more cheaply than they were made in the original sources. And then an effect of that was that Britain was able to start selling cotton, for example, back to India, the original source, because British cotton was now cheaper than the cotton of India. And so this was one thing that worried Mahatma Gandhi, that cheap British cotton imports were undermining the traditional cotton manufacturers of India, creating economic hardship and social unrest. And this is something that fueled his sense of injustice, and so was a driver of the campaign for Indian independence. So yes, import substitution, not just a dry piece of economic theory, but a fundamental driver of historical processes. Okay, our next economic principle is that of diminishing marginal returns. So let's draw a chart which will illustrate this. So what we're going to do is plot the effort you put into producing some effect, and up here the returns on your effort, what you get out of it. Diminishing marginal returns means that the relationship between effort and returns looks something like that. So if we put in this much effort, we'll get that much returns. If we put in that much effort, so an equal amount more, we'll get that much returns. So the size of the returns for this extra increase in effort is less than it was with that amount of input. They're the same amount of effort here and here, but with two different sizes of returns. And if we keep going here, we do 3 units of effort, it's even smaller, the extra return. So this is the marginal effort, and this is the marginal return. So by marginal we mean the extra bit, the bit at the margin. So you've done this much so far, and then you go beyond that margin to an extra bit here, and then you go beyond that margin to an extra bit here. So that's the marginal increase in effort. And this then is similarly the marginal return, the extra return you get for that extra bit of effort. And by diminishing marginal returns, we mean that it's decreasing. So we could also call it decreasing marginal returns. The marginal return is decreasing as you increase your amount of effort. For each extra unit of effort, you get a smaller amount of return. And an example of this might be, for example, with your advertising budget. So you've got a product, you're advertising it. You spend £1,000 on advertising and you get, £10,000 worth of sales. So the effort there is £1,000 of advertising spend, and the return is £10,000 of sales. But now you decide, well, let's increase our advertising budget to £2,000. So you've added another £1,000, but you're not going to get another £10,000 of sales because you're not going to be reaching that many more people. Your first adverts were on the side of the bus, and most people see the side of a bus. But then your next adverts are in a particular magazine or something, and then not everybody reads that magazine. So you're going to be reaching fewer people with your extra spend. You've already reached most people, but you're kind of mopping up a few people who haven't seen the first campaign. And then if you increase it again, another £1,000, you're reaching even fewer people, just some people living in very remote places who haven't seen your first lot of adverts. So there is a diminishing marginal return for your spend on advertising. And we can plot then here this as if we just call this, say, y and x. So y is the return, x is the effort. We've just seen we've got a curve like that. So this is the slope of the curve, which we should know from the mathematics model is written dy by dx. dy, this is the marginal return, it's the marginal output, the extra output you get, the extra return you get. So on the slope, that's dy there, and that's dx. And dx, that's the marginal input or the marginal effort. So dx, the extra effort, dy, the extra return. So when we talk about diminishing marginal returns, we're saying that the slope of this line is decreasing. dy by dx is decreasing as x increases. It's shallower and shallower slope. So if we plotted dy by dx against x, so we plot the slope of this line against x, well, we've just seen it's a steep slope here, it's becoming more and more shallow. So the slope is decreasing. So the slope is going to go down, something like that. So what we can see here is that the slope is always positive, it's always going uphill. You're always getting something out for your input, something positive, but the size of the output is decreasing. But here we see that the slope is actually decreasing, it's actually negative. And if we looked at the slope of this line, that's a negative slope, it's going downhill. So the slope of dy by dx is d by dx of dy by dx. In other words, d2y by dx squared. These are all things we covered in the mathematics module. So what we're saying here is then that d2y by dx squared is negative. It's less than 0. dy by dx is greater than 0. It's positive. So that's saying we're getting some return, but the rate or the size of increase, the increase of the return is negative. The rate of increase of the return is negative. d2y by dx squared is less than 0. That is the condition for diminishing marginal returns. So if the second derivative is negative, you have diminishing marginal returns. The returns are positive, but the marginal returns are diminishing. The rate of change of the marginal returns is negative. And this has been used as an explanation for why empires collapse. That for empires there is a law of diminishing marginal returns. So let's write this: empires. Let's say conquests and revenue. So if you're an expanding empire, your first conquests, are of the richest countries. So you get a lot out of those conquests. You conquer some very rich countries. But now you've conquered all the rich countries. So if you keep expanding your empire, you're starting to conquer countries that aren't so rich, poorer countries. So your conquests aren't going to bring you so much of an increase in revenue. And the more you keep conquering, the more you're reaching poorer and weaker and less useful societies. So your revenue is suffering from diminishing marginal returns. And if you think about the fact that to conquer a country costs money, then the costs are going to be increasing. The more conquests you do, the more you spend on costs. So that curve was revenue. This is the cost of your conquest. As this diminishes in its marginal returns, eventually the revenue you're getting is going to go below the costs of the conquests. So at this point, your empire can't really go beyond that, because any more conquests, it's just having a negative effect. It's bringing you less revenue than your costs. And people have suggested, well, this is then why empires collapse. But in fact, it only suggests that your empire will stop at that point. It will grow so far, but no further. But there's no particular reason why it should collapse. At this point, costs and revenue match. So you need some extra factor to explain why, once you get here or somewhere around there, your empire doesn't just stop there, but actually starts to go backward and collapse. And we will address that when we come on to the next module, which is all about political evolution, as part of which we will consider theories of empires. Okay, our next principle is returns to scale. So we could call this increasing marginal returns. The graph looks like this. So in this case, it bends upwards. So here we can say for this amount of return, that's the amount of effort we need to put in. Then to have one more unit of return, that's the amount of effort we need to put in. Then a third extra unit of return, that's the amount of effort we put in. So in this case, we can get the same increase in return for smaller increases of effort. So we're getting returns to scale, the scale of our operation. The more we do, the easier it becomes, the faster the returns come. So a small increase here produces the same return as a large increase earlier. So returns to scale, and we can see then this means that d2y by dx squared is positive, greater than 0. increasing marginal returns as opposed to decreasing marginal returns, as we've just seen. And we could also, of course, have equals to 0 in between, which would be a case of constant marginal returns, which would involve a straight line. And an example of where this might occur might be, say, if you want to set up a cake making business. So to set up a cake making business, to make your first cake is going to involve a lot of effort. You need to rent a kitchen, you need to buy a cooker, you need to buy some recipe books, then you need to get in supplies of flour and icing sugar and so on. So your first cake involves a lot of effort. But then to produce your second cake, a lot of that you don't need to do again, it's already been done. You might need to get some more flour and icing sugar, but you don't need to do all these other things. So your second cake is a bit easier. And then the more cakes you make, the easier it's going to become, because you start to get practiced at it. You find your favourite recipes, which ones that work, so you don't need to keep flicking through the book trying to find them and so on. So the more cakes you bake, the easier it becomes. And we can sort of model that by saying that your total costs of your business, C, the total cost, is going to be equal to the fixed cost. Let's just label that, that's the total cost. Fixed cost, which is things like the cooker and the recipe books, things that you really only buy once, but you can't get started in business until you bought those, plus the variable cost, which is the cost of each cake. So let's put that variable cost. So for example, for each cake you need a certain amount of flour and icing sugar and a certain amount of electricity to bake it. So each cake you make, you do have to pay that cost, but you don't need to do all these other things over again, the cost of the cooker and so on, the fixed cost. And of course it's not just the variable cost, but if you make 10 cakes, then it's 10 times the variable cost, or if you make n cakes, that's the number of items that you are producing, the total variable cost is going to be the number times the individual variable cost. And that adds up to the total cost, your outgoings as a business. And then we can consider the unit cost, how much it costs you per unit in total. So to find that, if we write just a little c for the unit cost, it's just your total cost divided by the total number. So, if you make 10 cakes, then you divide your total cost by 10 to get the cost per cake. And so from this equation, we can write that then as F over N plus NV over N, which is just V. So what we can see here then is that the unit cost decreases as n increases because of this sharing of the fixed cost over the n items that you produce. V is constant, F is constant, but as n increases, this whole thing becomes smaller. And this is known as amortization. Spreading a fixed cost over many units, amortization. And so causes of returns to scale can be amortization. So let's put causes of return to scale. One of them we've just seen. And another possible cause is specialization. So if your cake baking business gets big enough, you can have one person doing the icing and another person doing the mixing of the batter and another person doing the cooking. And by specializing in those individual tasks, your icing person become really good at icing and very efficient at doing it, and produce many iced cakes per hour. And similarly for the other tasks. So specialization allows you to become more efficient and so produce more cakes for a given amount of effort. And another cause of returns to scale is learning. So as you do more, you learn the skills more and you become better at it, and so again you can produce more for the same amount of effort. And this, in fact, the specialization leads us into Adam Smith's example of the pin factory, where he talked about the how specialization produces economic value. Pin factory. So he was thinking about not a cake making business but a pin making business, and he was saying that when people concentrate on the different tasks of making pins, they can be more efficient than when one person just makes the whole pin. So if one person makes the whole pin, they do this bit, then they do that, then they do that. They're constantly changing task from one thing to another, whereas when people specialize on just one little step in the process, they can churn that out much more quickly. So specialization producing returns to scale, and because then each person is more efficient at their particular part of it, you'll get many more pins than if each person was doing one at a time. And the same applies for trade between countries. So we can say here with the pin factory that specialization implies that everybody's better off because the specialists together produce more than the sum of their parts. And similarly in international trade, countries do better by specializing in what they're good at and then trading with other people. So all the different countries are like parts of the people in the pin factory. They're all specializing in particular things, and then the whole overall global output will be higher than if they each did own everything for themselves. So it's what's known as autarky. Is the opposite of specialization, is where you do everything for yourself. So countries that are autarkic, try to do everything for themselves, will in general be less prosperous than ones that participate in a global trading system where everybody is specializing. Because, to repeat, with the specialization, your overall output is higher due to returns to scale. And then if you're specializing and a part of that system, you're participating in that overall increase. But if you're autarkic, then you're not participating and you're just relying on what you do for yourself. You will make less of everything. Okay, our next topic is diminishing marginal utility. So this basically means that what you get out of something tends to decrease for every extra amount of it. So let's say you grow tomatoes, and you like tomatoes, and your first batch of tomatoes, that's good and tasty. But as you have more and more tomatoes, you don't really get so much out of those extra tomatoes. Some are nice, but more aren't really so much extra nice. You start to crave something else. But then your neighbour has a similar problem with cucumbers, because they're growing cucumbers and they like cucumbers, They eat a lot of cucumbers, but they've got so many cucumbers, they're not really enjoying those extra cucumbers. And so what you can do is you can swap some of your tomatoes for some of their cucumbers, and it's great to get some cucumbers because you're having diminishing utility from tomatoes. By utility we mean the usefulness, the value to you of that product, the tomatoes. But so you're getting less and less out of your tomatoes, but now you've got some cucumbers, and you haven't had any cucumbers, so this batch of cucumbers is gives you a lot of utility, a lot of pleasure. And similarly, your neighbour who's getting sick of cucumbers, it gets a lot of benefit, value, utility out of the tomatoes that you've given them. So diminishing marginal utility is a driver for trade. People who are producing this, because of their diminishing marginal utility from whatever they're producing, and other people's diminishing marginal utility gives them a motivation to swap, exchange, trade. Okay, our next principle is that of comparative advantage. So this is a more sophisticated way of understanding the motivations for trade. And what this says basically is that people do best if they specialise in what they're good at and then exchange. And you don't have to be better than everyone, but just so long as you specialise in what you are better at. So if there are two things, X and Y, if you're better at doing X than Y, then specialise in X and then exchange with other people for Y. So to repeat, you don't need to be better than everyone else at X, but just so long as you are better at X yourself than doing Y, then you'll be better off specialising in X. That's comparative advantage. So you don't have an absolute advantage necessarily. You're not better than everybody else, but comparatively you are better at that than the other thing in yourself. And this is probably best illustrated through an example. So I'm going to put up a table and then talk through that. Okay, so we're going to imagine two villages, we'll call them A and B, and two products, pots and shirts. And in this first table, we're going to consider that they are self-sufficient, autarkic, and we'll look at how many pots and shirts they produce. So we'll say that village A, if it concentrates on pots, it can make 20, let's say 20 per week. So this is a productivity per week. So village A can produce 20 pots per week, or if it focuses on shirts, it can produce 30 shirts per week. And we'll say that it wants to have as many pots as shirts. So the diminishing marginal utility of these items is such that you want exactly the same number of pots as shirts. If you get an extra shirt, and fewer pots, you actually want to change that around. You want to swap a shirt for a pot to get back to equilibrium, so that you want exactly the same numbers in these columns, so the output of pots and shirts. Well, what that means then is if village A can produce 20 pots or 30 shirts, well, what it can do is spend 60% of its time on pots. So 60% of 20 is 12. You'll get 12 pots, and it spends the other 40% of its time on shirts. 40% of 30 is 12. So it nicely balances pots and shirts. So by distributing its time in that way, it gets this equal balance of pots and shirts that it desires. And then in village B, we'll say that this one can only produce 8 pots per week if it focuses on pots. Or if it focuses on shirts, it could produce 24 shirts per week. Well, it still wants to balance pots and shirts. So in this case, we would find that the optimal allocation of effort is 75% to pots, 3/4 of the time to pots. So that 3/4 of 8 is 6. and the other quarter of the time, 25% of the time, to shirts, and a quarter of 24 is again 6. So it's balanced. They're not trading at the moment. They're purely self-sufficient, purely autarkic. But if we look at the two villages as a whole, there's a production of 18 pots between them and 18 shirts. Now, what we can see here is that A is better than village B in both items. It can produce more pots than village B for a given amount of time, and it can produce more shirts than village B. But it's much better comparatively at producing pots for than it is for shirts, because for pots it's 2.5 times as good. It can produce 2.5 times as much as B for this, in a week, whereas there it's only 5/4 of what village B can produce. So it's better, but it's not so much better as it is here. And the idea of comparative advantage is then that these villages will be better off if they specialise in what they're really good at. So for village A, that means specialising in pots. It's actually not as good at pots as shirts, but it has a comparative advantage that it's 2.5 times better than village B, compared to only 5/4 better than village B. So let's see how that works. We'll draw up another version of this table for when they decide to trade using this principle of comparative advantage. Okay, so here's how it looks when the villages decide to specialise and trade. And in this case, we find that the optimal allocation of effort is for village B to spend 100% of its time on pots and 0% on shirts. So with 100% of time on pots, it will produce 20 pots and 0 shirts. Whereas for village B, it's best if it spends 12.5%, 1/8 of its time on pots, and the other 7/8, 87.5% on shirts. And what that gives us then is 1/8 of the time on pots, so it produces 1 pot, and 7/8 of the time on shirts, 7/8 of 24 is 21.
The table and discussion in the course textbook contain a couple of errors. The numbers here are correct.
And so the total pots produced is 20 in village A, 1 in village B, adding up to 21, and village B produces the 21 shirts, gives a total of 21. So now we can see that the total output of the villages is higher with their specialisation than when they each did both things. It's higher, and it also satisfies this condition that it's equal. We find that by these is the numbers that will produce this equality. Now, if they just did this, then each one would be unhappy, because this has 20 pots and no shirts, and it wants an equal number. And this similarly has many shirts, but only 1 pot, so it's also going to be unhappy. So what they need to do is trade so that they can each get back to an equal amount. But what that trade looks like depends. So there are many possibilities. Let's draw up a little table to show how the trade can work out. Okay, so for the trade, well, pots are obviously going to flow in this direction from village A to village B, because it's got too many pots, not enough shirts, and vice versa. This has got too many shirts, not enough pots. So pots are going to flow in this direction. How many pots? Well, from village A's perspective, it can be no more than 8, because if you take 8, it will be left with 12 pots. Anything more than that, it will have fewer pots than it had before, so it wouldn't be worthwhile. So it is going to be a maximum of 8 pots, so that it's no worse than if it just did everything itself. And what about for B? Well, before it had 6 pots, it currently only has 1, so it's got to have a minimum of 5 pots. in this trade. And for this one, similar principles then. For A, it's got to be a minimum of 12. It needs at least 12 shirts in order to be back where it started. So minimum of 12. And for B, it's got 21 shirts at the moment. It doesn't want to give any more away than that would leave it with 6. So it can't be anything more than 15, because that would leave it with 15. So the maximum size of the transfer of shirts from B to A has got to be 15 from B's perspective. Well, this leaves the possibility of a trade. Any trade from 5, 6, 7 or 8 pots would satisfy them both, because it can, 5, 6, 7 or 8 is less than 8 or less than or equal to 8 and is more than or equal to 5. So both are satisfied there, and similarly 12, 13, 14, 15 shirts going in the other direction would satisfy both villages, would meet their conditions. So it really then depends on who's going to be the best negotiator. A is going to come and say, look, we'll offer you well, anywhere between 5, 6, 7 or 8. So they might start off by saying, well, we'll offer you 5 pots in return for 15 shirts. And if B's not a very good negotiator, it will say, okay, then, we're all right with that. We'll be at least no worse off. But they're more likely to say, well, no, we're not going to accept 5 because, we're no better off than before. We'll take 6 from you. Or they might try 7. And these, similarly over here, they'll say, well, we're not going to give you 15, but we'll give you 13. So they will eventually come down on some set of values of so many pots for so many shirts that leaves each one a little bit better off than before. So let's say it was 6 going in this direction. So they will now have 14 and these will have 7. So with pots, both are better off. They had 14 instead of 12. They have 7 instead of 6. So they're happy there. And if we say, let's say 14 going in this direction, then these are left with 7 instead of 6. And these are left with 14 again instead of 12. So again, both villages are better off. And in that particular case, A struck the harder bargain. But now let's suppose that actually everything goes in B's favour. So B gets its maximum preferred 8 and only gives away its minimum preferred 12. So let's say we'll draw up a little result here. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say that everything goes B's way. So B drives the hardest bargain. So we'll say here then that B manages to extract from A the maximum that A is prepared to give away, which was 8. So it drives a great hard bargain. It screws 8 pots out of A. So that means that it started off with 1, it's got 8, so it's got 9 now. And because A has given away 8 pots, it's only left with 12. And then with shirts, again, we'll say that everything goes B's way. So B manages to hold 8. It will only give away its minimum that it's prepared to give. It will just give away the 12 shirts that A will accept as its minimum. And because it started off with 21, it's just given 12 to A. It's left with 9 shirts. So in this trade that has gone all B's way, A is actually no better off than before. It's got 12 and 12 after the trade. This is not very likely, but I'm just using this scenario to make a point. And then B, though, is better off than before. It's got it had 6 and 6, now it's 9 and 9. But what B might say to this is, oh, well, hang on, this isn't fair. why have I only got 9 pots and 9 shirts when you've got 12 and 12? Well, it is perfectly fair because A is more productive in pots and shirts than B. B is actually, either lazy or inefficient or whatever, doesn't produce as much as either product on its own. That is why it ends up with less. So it's not unfair at all. In fact, this is more unfair to A because A doesn't even get anything out of this trade. But B says, well, look, hang on, we're a poor village. Look, we've only got less of everything. It's not fair. This trade isn't working for us. Well, of course, the trade is working for B because if B was on its own, it would only have 6 and 6. So with the idea that with comparative advantage and the idea that you do better off by specializing and exchanging, it doesn't mean that everybody's going to come out of it on top or equal. The people who are more efficient in the first place will still be better off, more prosperous than the people who are less efficient. So the trade makes B better off compared to if it didn't trade at all, but it doesn't mean that it comes up to the same standard of living as A because of its underlying lack of productivity. Okay, now I just want to make a little addendum to that discussion of comparative advantage about how this works in the real world. So we have seen a very simple, abstract, theoretical example. But in the real world, there aren't just 2 products, just 2 villages. There are many, many different products that each village or society or country produces and could potentially exchange with many other different villages, societies or countries. So the calculations are much more complex than that one, and it's arguable whether there is even a particular single solution that optimizes it. So if there is, it's not something that people are going to be able to work out what it is. So in the real world, there will be even more negotiation going on and deciding what to specialize in and how much you're going to trade for what, and it will all depend upon people's different skills and bargaining power, and there's a very complex situation going on. And furthermore, when you do choose to specialize in one thing or another, that may mean that there will be winners and losers. So if in your country there are the potters and the shirt makers, and you decide that actually you're much better off if you just specialize in pot making and not in shirts, then all the shirt makers in your country suddenly find that they've gone out of business because you are much better off exchanging your pots, making lots of pots and exchanging them with another country. Well, what those shirt makers should do is start to move into the pot making in your country, but people who are trained to make shirts don't suddenly become potters overnight. So when these kinds of adjustments go on in international trade, it creates strains within the economies of the villages or the countries that are involved in this decision making about what should we specialize in, what should we trade with others, and so on. So yes, in the long run, your country may be better off specializing in pots, but that means a lot of pain for the shirt makers who are going to have to retrain as potters or stay on the dole, but their children will learn to become potters, whatever. Also, countries may have reasons for wanting to keep alive industries that they actually may not be particularly efficient in. They may not have a comparative advantage, but it may be that village B decides, or village A, whichever it was, decides it wants to keep a shirt making capability, even though it would be better off specializing in pots. But it wants to keep its shirt making capability because maybe it will go to war with village B in the future, and then it won't have any shirts. because it depends on Village B for its shirts. So it wants to keep alive a bit of a shirt making capability, so that if it did find itself at war with Village B and therefore its supply of shirts were cut off, it could then, it's retained some of that knowledge of how to make shirts, and then it could ramp up its shirt making industry again. So yes, in the real world, things are a lot more complex than that simple example, but it illustrates a principle that underlies these processes of trade. Okay, our next principle is the classic idea of supply and demand. So according to this, a good like a pot, tomatoes, shirts, has a price, and the supply increases with the price. If shirts can fetch an awful lot of money, then a lot of people want to start making shirts. So the higher the price, the more the supply. The more people will move into that very lucrative business. Conversely, the more the price goes up, the more the demand for it falls, so that the more expensive it is, the more people won't be able to afford it, or will decide that it's not worth it. So as it gets more and more expensive, fewer and fewer people want to buy it, so the demand goes down. And where they cross then is the equilibrium price, at which supply matches demand. So everybody who is producing this good will find a buyer, because there's as many people wanting to buy as there is supplies to satisfy them. And everybody who wants to buy it will be satisfied, because there's as many people trying to supply them as there is demand. Again, so supply and demand balance out, and this creates this, then that will be the equilibrium price that you would expect the good to fetch in the market. And it is a stable equilibrium, because if the price increases, then there will be too much supply, not enough demand. So there will be a lot of suppliers who can't sell their goods. So what they'll do is they'll cut price, discount them, put them on sale to try and encourage people to buy. So the price will fall back. And on the other hand, if the price falls, then there will be a lot of demand and not enough supply. So the suppliers will find that they can put the price up, because there's this is something rare. There's lots of people wanting to buy it, and so they can put the price up a bit and still sell. And so the price will move back towards this. So it's a stable equilibrium price. And now our next principle is what's known as Say's law. And what this says is that supply creates demand. It's as simple as that. So in the previous principle of supply and demand, we just imagined that there was a prior pre-existing scale of preferences that people have that determines their demand for a good. But Say's law says, well, actually, in reality, the very fact of supplying something can make people want it. Before, they didn't know that they wanted it because they didn't even know it existed. So they're not buying it because it doesn't exist. Then they're not even seeking it. But so something like the potato, for example, in medieval Europe, because potatoes come from America, potatoes didn't exist. So there was no demand for potatoes. When somebody started bringing potatoes back from the New World, that created a demand. People saw, oh, what's this? Potatoes. Oh, what can you do with them? Oh, what do they taste like? Oh, actually, they're not too bad. So the very fact of being able to supply something can create a demand for it. Or a new app, for example. Before the app didn't exist, there was no demand for that app. But once you've made the app, it can create a demand among people. They've heard about this. Oh, that looks really good. Let's get that app. Or still similarly something like AI. Before it really came along in the last couple of years, there wasn't really a demand for AI. People weren't going through their lives thinking, oh my God, I can't exist without AI. What can I do? How can I get by without AI? Of course not. There was no demand for AI at all. But when AI came along, people are very interested in it, and it has created a demand for AI. So that's Say's law. And our final economic topic or principle is the idea of interest. Interest on a loan, or the interest you get by putting your money in a savings account, that kind of interest. So suppose you have a field, you've inherited a field, and you could grow potatoes in that field. But the trouble is that you don't have a tractor, and you haven't got enough money to buy a tractor. So you're in a bit of a vicious circle. You can't buy a tractor, so you can't use the field to grow your potatoes, so you still can't afford a tractor. So what you can do to break out of that vicious circle is go and borrow a tractor. But someone's not going to lend you their tractor for free. They're going to charge you to rent out that tractor to you. And you're okay with that, because with that tractor you can then plough your fields and plant your potatoes and make enough money out of your potatoes to pay for the tractor or the rental on the tractor and have a bit more left over. And so that's what you do. So you are renting a tractor and using it then to make money that covers the rent on the tractor and a bit more, so you make a profit. But let's suppose that it's not just a tractor that you need. You need a whole lot of things. You need workers to work in your field. You need stationery to manage your business. You need an office. You need to pay for advertising of your potatoes. You need transport to get your potatoes to the wholesaler, and so on. So you need a whole load of things to make your potato business viable, not just the tractor. Well, what can you do? Well, you could hire all those things individually, but that might be very complicated, because you don't necessarily know in advance how much of each thing you want, and you want a bit more flexibility, because maybe you don't need to take those workers on the whole year, and it will also depend on what the crop's like and so on. So you want that flexibility. So what you do is, instead of hiring all the individual goods and services separately, you just want to have some money that you can spend on these things ad hoc as you go through the year. And so you want to rent not a tractor, but some money that you can then use in your potato growing business. And so it's like the tractor. You take some money and you spend it through the year, and just as at the end of the year with the tractor you have to give the tractor back, and you've also paid this rental on it, so with the money at the end of the year you have to give that money back, and you've also paid your rent for renting that money. So that is the interest that you have paid on that amount of money. Like you paid rental on the tractor, you paid rental on the money. That is interest. And it's worth your while, because you've got this money in, you've just given it back, same as you got the tractor, you gave the tractor back, and you've given the extra rent and you've given the interest, but you made so much money from your potatoes that you've covered that interest and plus a bit more, so you've made a profit. So it's worth renting that money or paying that interest on that money. And interest is related to the interest rate, the amount of rental you pay on borrowing money is related to time preference. So what do we mean by that? Well, supposing you're somebody who, as soon as you get your pay packet, you want to spend it. So you want to spend it on drink or on books or whatever it is that you enjoy. But it's burning a hole in your pocket. You want to spend it as soon as possible to get pleasure and enjoyment out of it. So you have a short time preference. And that for the enjoyment value of your money. You want to enjoy it as quickly as possible. Your time preference is for a short interval between getting this money and being able to enjoy it. So if somebody comes along to you and says, hey, could I borrow some money? So that I could plough my field and run my potato business, you're going to say, oh no, I don't really want to lend it to you because I want to spend that on the things that I enjoy, because you have a short time preference. And they say, well, come on, I really, really need this money. And you're going to say, well, okay, but you're going to have to pay a lot of interest on it to make it worth my while. It's really painful for me to part with this money. So I'm going to charge you a high rent. Just like, if the tractor owner doesn't really want to end out their tractor, they're going to charge you a lot to borrow it from them. So the interest rate shows your time preference. A short time preference will mean a high interest rate. It's also, you can present it the other way around, because the person who's coming to borrow the money and says, hey, I want to borrow that money, and you're saying, oh well, I really need it, if they have a short time preference too, because unless they get their potato crop in now, it won't be ready and they won't make any money, so they really need that money now, so they have a short time preference, they're prepared to meet your demand for a high interest rate. So if people in society have a short time preference, interest rates will tend to be high, and conversely, if they have a long time preference, they will be low. So if you're not that bothered about spending your pay packet, then you're just going to put it in the bank. Then somebody wants to borrow it from you, you're going to be much more easy about lending it to them, and you won't insist on such a high interest rate. And also, if they're pretty casual about whether they borrow that money now or later, then again, if you try to charge too much interest, they're going to say, oh well, I'm not really, I don't really need it that much. So long time preference means a low interest rate. And we can also say then that the interest rate depends upon feelings about the future, because those kind of affect your time preference. So if you then, for example, are worried about the future, or the future seems very uncertain and very unstable, you're not going to want to lend your money out because you're not really sure whether you'll ever get it back, or or you may think that although you feel as though you could lend it now, things might happen in the next few weeks that could mean that you really need that money, some kind of disaster or something. So, or you might lose your job, so you're worried about losing your job, so you are not going to want to lend out that money because you think you might need it. So your feelings about how stable and predictable the future looks is going to affect your time preference, and therefore affect the interest rate. So the broader conclusion from that is that the interest rate reflects social conditions, where by social conditions I mean more generally social, economic and political conditions. So social conditions, how the government's behaving, what the chances of war are, what the chances of natural disaster are. Those social conditions affect people's feelings about the future, which then affect their time preference. So they affect the interest rate. And all this is relevant because if we look through history, and as far as we can go back with interest rates, there has been a tendency for the interest rate to decline. So it's gone up and down. Times of war, the interest rate has increased. Times of stability, it's decreased. But over the general course of history, the interest rates have declined. And they've particularly declined in the more prosperous and stable countries. So that in more warlike, less developed countries today, ones that have internal insurgencies and so on, the interest rates are still high because there's a lot of concern about the future and short time preference. So their interest rates remain high. People are less confident of getting their money back in those kinds of countries. But in the global leaders, the more prosperous and stable countries, interest rates have declined. So a declining interest rate is an index of stability and prosperity.